I'm absolutely overjoyed to be here in my Exmoor farmhouse talking to Craig Brown, award-winning, acclaimed satirist, parodist, author, all-round good egg, and author of 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time, the smash hit of spring and summer 2020. Craig, can you introduce yourself and your book for our listeners and watchers, please?
Yes, well, I'm really a sort of satirist, I suppose, but I have a little sideline. Perhaps you did. I wasn't concentrating. I was looking at myself in the picture. But I have a little sideline in books, which are, I suppose, semi-satirical. And the last one was about Princess Margaret, which is more satirical than this one, I suppose. And this one's 1, 2, 3, 4. The Beatles in Time.
Have you got a copy you can hold up? Because mine's been stolen.
It's got a lovely cover, and that's one of the shames. I mean, you're a victim of this too. But with the lockdown, I feel that if people saw this book in the bookshop, they would just be immediately drawn to it because it's a lovely object, and it looks just such fun.
It definitely is.
So it's a shame they can't see that. Anyway, so it's a kind of kaleidoscopic portrait of the Beatles. So it goes in a vaguely chronological way, but with lots of sort of stops along the way and goes backwards and forwards in time to some extent. And it also rather concentrates on people who have previously been on the sidelines, like their dentist who gave them drugs, or Helen Shapiro, or Cliff Richard even. They all have quite big parts in it.
Also the person who had to stand in for Ringo Starr on that tour to Australia.
Oh yes, well there are these, I mean, whenever anyone is really successful, there are people who kind of get lost in in the wake of the boat, if that's what boats have. And it is this rather tragic story in it, a completely tragic story. Ringo was suddenly taken ill, I think it was 1964, beginning of, when they were about to go on a tour of Scandinavia and Australia, and they had to get a replacement in 24 hours. And they got this man who was doing temporary drumming for Georgie fame called Jimmy Nicol. And for 10 days, he was really famous. He was almost as famous as the other Beatles. He just became Ringo. They quickly, that afternoon, kitted him out with a suit, gave him a Beatles haircut, put him on the plane with them. And he appeared at all their press conferences. All the world was interested in him. Perhaps in some respect, more interested in him than the other Beatles, because he was the new kid on the block. And it all went to his head. Ringo then joined them in, I think, Melbourne or Sydney, and he had to give up his place back to Ringo. And he came back to England all full of his own fame, and then left Georgie fame, started his own band, paid them too much, and nothing went right. Yeah. And within a year, he'd gone bankrupt and left his wife. And now, the last sighting of him was about 10 years ago at a Beatles.
Is he alive? He died?
Well, people think he is, but it's a bit like the Loch Ness Monster. No one quite knows, or Lord Lucan. He was last seen at a Beatles fan club convention in Amsterdam about 10 years ago, but it might have been someone who just looked like him. And so people can disappear like that.
He was a Beatle and now he's the lost Beatle. The book is, can you tell us a bit about why you did it? It's 50 years since they broke up, isn't it? The Beatles in 1970, or have I got even that wrong?
No, it was 50 years in April, which is rather extraordinary. And they were really only going as sort of recording artists for 8 years, 1962 to 1970. Well, I did it because they just were so much part of my life. I was born in 1957. So I was sort of 10 when Sergeant Pepper came out. And if around that time, they just were everything to everyone. And so quite a lot of the book is spent with sort of reminiscing about hearing them when I was shut away in prep school and these odd encounters. My father was in Long Melford in Suffolk on a sort of shooting trip, and he was going into the hotel, I think it's called the Bull Hotel in Long Melford, as John and Yoko were coming out in 1969. And I really remember him well, so I'd have been 12. My father came back and he said, but I stood my ground. And so John and Yoko had to give way to my father. So there are these tiny little encounters. Which
I know, it's very pointillist or impressionistic. I mean, there's so much to say. I wondered if we could talk a bit about your favoritism with regards to the Beatles. I think one reviewer suggested that Ringo is your favorite. I think John Lennon comes out very badly, but Aunt Mimi rather well. Can you, at the end of the book, did you change your view of any of the Beatles and reorder your favourites?
Well, I didn't consciously, write in order to big people up or put them down. I mean, I suppose I was slightly less interested in George than the others. I mean, either fairly or unfairly. So he features slightly less. Ringo I rather liked just because he's the kind of Dr. Watson figure among Sherlock Holmeses. He's the sort of plodder, but he kind of enjoyed himself. Brian Epstein said he always appreciated Ringo because Ringo wasn't bitter that he was less talented than the others, and that's kind of a quality. It's people actually now, serious musicians say actually he was a very good drummer. And at the time that he joined the Beatles, he was more famous than the Beatles. They were really pleased to have got him. I mean, locally in Liverpool.
In Liverpool. The other thing I enjoyed was the precedence that the Beatles took over the Rolling Stones, which I think you delineate brilliantly. And actually terribly satisfying. It gave me a lot of satisfaction.
Yes, well, actually, the row between the Stones and the Beatles still lingers. In that last month or the month before, Paul McCartney said in an interview, Paul McCartney now sort of 78 or something, said in an interview that the Rolling Stones were always copying the Beatles. And then Mick Jagger got, also that age, got really shirty and said no. And so the row still goes. And also I did find when I was telling people that I was writing a book about the Beatles, quite a lot of, especially men, would say, oh, well, I always preferred the Rolling Stones, as if it was a real sort of virtue to have always preferred the Rolling Stones. And people are, 50 years on, people are still taking sides about the Stones and the Beatles. But I think actually if you look at all the different records chronologically and compare the times, the Rolling Stones are copying the Beatles a lot of the time. In things like album covers, as well as songs like, We Love You came 6 months after All You Need Is Love, and they're kind of similar in style and arrangement and that kind of.
I love the story you tell of Paul McCartney arriving at the Beggars' Banquet party with a copy of Hey Jude.
Yes.
And everybody...
I don't know whether he did that consciously, but yeah. So the Stones were having this big party in Tottenham Court Road nightclub when Tottenham Court Road was trendy. And with playing their new album, and suddenly halfway through, Paul McCartney comes in and says to the disc jockey, I think that their album has been played. He says, oh, do you want to play this? It's our new single. And he puts on Hey Jude, and the whole party comes to an end. And suddenly the focus is on Paul, which must have been very disheartening for Mick Jagger.
I was surprised. I mean, I admit, I follow Yoko Ono on Twitter.
Yeah,
and actually, it's a part of her performance shtick. She's actually very good on Twitter. But the way you paint her is a sort of grasping, manipulative husband stealer. Whereas Aunt Mimi, who had always come across in previous books I've read about the Beatles as a forbidding, rather unloving aunt and mother figure, comes out, I think, as one of the heroines of the book. How do you think the women come out?
Well, certainly with Aunt Mimi, I give a chapter pro and a chapter con. I think you could say I do come out in favour, because first, John Lennon was a very trying young boy, shoplifting and all that kind of, not terrible, but he had a very rackety mother and father. And there was her with her Encyclopedia Britannicas and her sensible attitude. And I think she did keep him on the straight and narrow. And I think actually completely in her favour is that right up until the end, I think even the night before he died, John Lennon was seeing her every single week, and lots of letters. And so he did, and that was unlike him. You wouldn't imagine he'd be like that. And so I think he did really love her and appreciate her. And so I think she's perfectly all right.
Did he, I mean, I mean, I'm not sure how deep you drill into the whole sort of psychological kind of origins of people like John Lennon, but did he have abandonment issues, which meant he was so rebellious, which actually created one of their most appealing characteristics, which was they didn't really suck up ever to authority. They didn't care about prime ministers and the Queen.
I think it's amazing. Yeah, if you see them on YouTube, which I've over and over again watched, especially the press conferences in America, none of them have been to America before. They get off the plane, go to a press conference. They're just themselves. They're not cowed by anyone. They're not overawed, and they're not chippy or anything. They're just themselves. And I think that made them very unique, because until then, you know, working class Britons were seen as kind of John Osborne, kind of embittered,
angry
characters, all their sort of chirpy figures in Ealing comedies. And they were just Beatles were themselves. And I think that changed, had a huge sociological impact.
They were very funny too. I mean,
yeah.
They were
and
very
actually,
funny.
Going back to what you said about his difficult background, obviously he did, but actually at that time he didn't have that self-pity developed with the fame. Weirdly, he didn't have the self-pity before that. So if you see him at those press conferences, he's really enjoying himself as much as Ringo or Paul or George. And it's only later, maybe with the influence of drugs, and then later, I think the influence of Yoko, who wanted him to sort of channel into the self-pity, that it all kind of goes pear-shaped for him.
It's extraordinary how quickly they went from being the suited and booted Beatles haircuts, joking and very quick, very funny repartee, as you say, not frightened of anybody, the world at their feet, to 4 young, very young men in a room not speaking to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think that happens. So it's not, and there are some advantages to it having happened, in that the Rolling Stones, to go back to them, the last 40 years have been a kind of tribute band to the Rolling Stones. They've been sort of copycatting, but just looking older. Otherwise, the Beatles had a beginning and a middle and end, and that makes them a perfect story. So for me, so selfishly, that's quite good. And I think it's just inevitable when you have that amount of fame, all those pressures on you. I mean, Paul quite recently explained it, that everyone, when they went individually into rooms, people would treat them each as a god. And then when they saw each other, of course, they knew that they were just these lads from Liverpool. And they each individually preferred to be treated like a god. And so I think that can't help. There were terrible finance issues. I mean, basically, I remember the manager of U2 saying that all groups, they say they break up because of musical differences or whatever. It's always money. That's why U2 always, they have the same amount each, regardless of who wrote the song. And
so what kept the Stones together in that case? Isn't Mick famously mean? I mean,
Mick is, I think, he went to the LSE. He's jolly good at economics. And they did have a dodgy time with Alan Klein immediately before Alan Klein took over the Beatles, and he tried to warn the Beatles off Alan Klein. But I think the continuing success of the Rolling Stones is very much down to Mick Jagger's brilliant sort of management skills, because they're not. I mean, the last time, I think they've just had a top 10 hit.
I think one of your...
About the top 10. But the last top 10 they had was about 1983 before then.
Who were you talking about, the Rolling Stones?
The Rolling Stones, yeah. So it's an amazing achievement to keep this tribute band on the road. I mean, successfully. They're perfectly good at what they're doing. I'm not being rude, being slightly rude.
Have you ever seen the Stones live? And did you had never seen the Beatles live?
Oddly enough, I saw them in sometime in the 70s, and then I saw them again, I think last year at the O2.
And did you enjoy the experience?
Almost by mistake. Well, they're very good, but if you see anything at the O2, it's like watching someone on a small television at the end of a field through the binoculars the wrong way. So you if you weren't looking at the screen, you wouldn't be able to tell which was Mick Jagger and which was Charlie Watts, really. And so therefore you're looking at the screen, in which case, why not watch it at home? Anyway, that's another issue.
I think one of your achievements is that you've reinvented biography, and it's a great relief. Must be a great relief to future biographers that you don't have to start at the beginning and finish at the end, even though there is a chronological arc to your book. You can choose, just as a novelist can, to choose the most interesting bits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way it's just my mental laziness that I don't want to read about someone's great grandparents. I mean, or you know, it was especially true of the Princess Margaret book I did, that if she was going on a trip to Canada, you don't want to know what she was wearing each day in 1953 in Toronto, or, you know, and yet the royal biographers all think, oh, you've got to put everything in month by month. But with her, I just did the interesting stuff and threw out the dull stuff. And the Beatles is different because they're almost every day, every minute of every day, something of interest was happening.
And the Queen said,
it is a way of just homing in on things which catch your fancy.
Didn't the Queen herself say, think what we'd have missed if we didn't have the Beatles?
Yes, it was. I mean, I'm not saying she's insincere, but obviously Britain would be different, but I can't really see her sitting down and listening to Yellow Submarine of an evening. But I mean, it was a nice thing to say.
Do you think they still have the same hold on your children's generation as they did on yours?
No, I mean, it couldn't.
They can't have done.
It couldn't be quite the same hold because in my generation, you wanted to know what was going to happen next, and everyone, when a new single came out. I mean, I remember even my aunt, who wasn't interested in pop, she said, you know, have you heard Get Back? And what did you think of it? And so everyone was really interested in it. And so you couldn't have that power. And obviously people aren't going to change their fashion now in that way to go with Sgt. Pepper or whatever. Nevertheless, I do find that my children, sort of late 20s, early 30s, they do know all the songs, I think. I mean, and I certainly didn't know every song that Joe Loss was playing, or George Formby, you know, or Vera Lynn. And so they have got a kind of permanence, and which I imagine will be around forever.
You know, people who wrote them off at the time, I mean, I think you quote Paul Johnson was one of them.
Yeah.
Do you think that they felt they had to stick to their guns on that? Or do you think by the end of his life, Paul Johnson might admit he was wrong and the Beatles we will never see a band like the Beatles again, musically, culturally, in terms of a phenomenon in bursting into the 60s?
I mean, I could see, I mean, I know Paul a little bit. I also feature my late father-in-law, Colin Welsh, who was deputy editor of the Telegraph. And he had sort of serious intellectual worries about the Beatles. He thought their music was all too easy and that it was instant gratification. And I can see that there is an argument for that. Nevertheless, I think if he was comparing it to other popular music of his own day, he'd have to admit it stood up quite well. I think he was also, that generation were also the war generation. They had some justifiable grievances against people, you know, that their teen years and early 20s were spent fighting and having a horrid time, and then they had to get straight back to work. And then the next generation is just having the most outrageous fun. And you know, and I think there's some argument for that. I'm not sure that if I'd been in that generation, I wouldn't have felt slightly the same.
Yes, I mean, those who had to have their teenage years in the 60s must be absolutely fear-hopping about what happened in the 60s.
Yeah.
I want to tell everybody how incredibly entertaining your book is, and how, even if you think you know everything about the Beatles, what you've done is you've sieved through anything boring, and you've really left us with the most sparkling, glittering anecdotes, and 150 chapters, each one of which absolutely stands for itself. And you've just got a brilliant magpie eye for the detail, the funny detail. And if you didn't find these things, you know what we're going to find funny, and it's always absolutely spot on. It's a sad book as well, because it tells the tale of, you know, incredible success, but the dark side of all of that, the grimness, the fights, the neuroses, the unabandoned women.
Yeah, I was talking to,
Yeah.
or were you concluding? Sorry, do you want me to?
No, I'm not at all. Please keep going.
I was talking to Eleanor Bron on the phone the other day, who was, of course, their sort of co-star in Help. And she had very happy memories of Help, and she loved the Beatles and loved working with them, and said it was a very happy time. But she rang me up after having finished the book, saying how sad it had made her, and that she hadn't realized the amazing pressure they were under. And she'd sort of semi-seen that they hadn't been able to leave their house when they wanted to, or that kind of thing. And I think it depressed her that they'd had such a hard time of it at the end, and that they had, in a way, stopped smiling. I mean, they then all kind of recovered, but and so yes, I can't remember now why I interrupted you, but anyway, that was.
Well, I mean, I think it's such a cliche. It's such a cliche to say this, and it seems so sad that it happened to the Beatles, who are this vibrant, you know, spring-like movement into the darkness of post-war Britain and after the rationing of the 50s. But you know, fame being the mask that eats the face, and they were the first famous men in the world. How
they
could
were.
they live?
I mean, it should be said also that that their last albums were pretty. I mean, they're pretty amazing. I think Abbey Road, that second side of Abbey Road, is the best thing they ever did. And so even when they might not have been getting on so well personally, they could still do amazing harmonies. They could still, and not all those songs were written together or worked on together, or played together. But I mean, it didn't actually, their artistry kept going to the end. And maybe it was more interesting because of these conflicts, and that they couldn't have carried on doing those kind of sweet, merry songs, I Want to Hold Your Hand, or that kind of thing. You couldn't have done that for the next 6 years. And their progression was amazing, I think. And so maybe we're all the beneficiaries of that sort of sour period they went through.
You've also harvested and sort of accounts of people's own obsessions with the Beatles of our age group. I'm using that loosely, like Ruby Wax or Mary Killen, who are household names now, and who became really obsessional about the Beatles as young girls. And actually, you brilliantly explain the whole business of the screaming as well, which Ivo, my husband's brother, went to a Beatles concert, and he said it was absolutely intolerable because they were peeing and screaming. Basically.
Yes. I know. It's extraordinary that level of hysteria.
We haven't seen that
all over the world. You know, in Japan and
extraordinary. What did people? Has it been replicated by any other band? The screaming.
It was. I mean, the first person, as far as I can see, who had it was Frank Sinatra way before them, and then Elvis Presley. But I think not to that extent. Then afterwards, obviously, Bay City Rollers. Or did you ever scream at a band?
Never. Although I did have a Bay City Rollers poster in my bedroom in Belgium.
Right.
Which was very exciting.
But I think, and also they were the first stadium band in America. These huge stadiums. I mean, the sound equipment couldn't really. It was nothing like the same. And so you could only hear the screams, you couldn't hear the music. Maybe now the music would be able to drown out the screams. But that's essentially why they gave up. I think it was George who said, I'm never doing that again, after they did their last concert in San Francisco. Because they couldn't hear themselves playing, and they knew that whatever they played, it didn't matter. People would just carry on screaming and enjoy it. And they were ambitious. They were musically ambitious. They wanted to progress, and they knew they couldn't if no one was listening.
John Lennon would be 80 this year. He was born in 1940.
It is quite extraordinary.
Extraordinary thought. I wonder if there's going to be anything.
Yoko is only. She was born in 1933, so she's only 3 years younger than Princess Margaret. And sort of 7 years younger or something than the Queen, which is rather extraordinary.
So when, just going back to the sort of Mary Killen's, just, you know, absolute certainty she was going to marry Paul McCartney, say, or Ruby Wax going to a Beatles concert. How did you know they were huge Beatles fans? Did you elicit?
I mean, some time ago, I shared a flat with Mary. I mean, this is in the 80s. We were flatmates. And I remembered her saying that she had originally come from Larne in Northern Ireland. I think it was on the day she finished her A-levels. And she thought that London was roughly the same size as Larne. And so she was pretty sure that the Beatles would be there at the airport to meet her. And so she, and all the time growing up in Larne, she thought her father was a doctor. And she thought when the Beatles came to play Belfast, which I think they only did once, but she was pretty sure that Paul McCartney would be ill or need a bandage or something. And so her father would ask him into the house, and the minute he set eyes on Mary, he'd say, "I must marry that girl." I think a lot of people entertain these. They're almost more than fantasies. You know, people really believe
they're real.
Yeah,
well, you say that's very, but bizarrely, when we moved to London from Somerset in about 1969, we didn't have anywhere to live, and so we stayed in Cavendish Avenue in St John's Wood in my grandparents' house, and it was right next door to Paul McCartney. So in fact, I did see Paul McCartney when I came to London. So Mary Killen's anecdote really,
but you didn't get married to him, did you? Or did you?
No, but the girls, the fans, so you would get these girls in sort of psychedelic Mary Quant mini dresses and absolutely done up with their fake eyelashes and their sort of white lipstick. And my grandparents' house was exactly next door, had a gate, and they all thought that it was our house. And so there would be a sort of Dominic Cummings style scrum of them outside the house and ringing the bell and saying, "Is Paul there?" Just like Mary would have done.
Did your grandparents get on with?
I think he was a very good neighbour.
Yeah.
I mean, that story you tell of how he went on he wanted to go and see the English countryside, you know, when he was on a drive, and they darted off into somewhere near the Thames.
It's called Harold, Harrald, which they chose because of its funny name. They
ended up having dinner with a couple and going to, you know, you tell the story. It's an amazing story. Paul.
They were coming back from, he recorded the Black Dyke Mills band, which is this brass band up north. They were coming back. They're all kind of quite stoned. And so they decided to go to this village in Harold. They wanted to stop off somewhere on the way. And they saw a man cutting a hedge or mowing his lawn who was a dentist. There were quite a lot of dentists in the book. And they said, which way is to the river or to the pub? And he told them. And then he said to his wife, "You'll never guess who just put his head over the hedge. It was Paul McCartney." And she said, "We got to find him." So they rushed to the pub. Anyway, they then had Paul back to their house, gave him dinner. He was terribly nice to the crippled father who's upstairs. And they mentioned they were giving then he played them Hey Jude. He played Hey Jude for the first ever live performance of Hey Jude. And then a week later, they'd mentioned that they were having a sort of jamboree for the National Gardens Fund or National Youth Club or something. And he sent them a bottle of champagne to put in the tombola for it. And so, he's very well known. Yeah.
I mean, okay, we've got to wrap up, but at the end of it, I mean, is it possible to say which one you liked most or which one in the end you thought? I mean, to me, I'm afraid the scale slightly fell from my eyes over John Lennon, particularly because you put in the picture of him naked with Yoko.
Yeah, I mean, I withheld some stuff about John because it was so unpleasant. But you know, he obviously had incredible talent. But I eventually, if I had to choose my favorite, it would be Paul McCartney, just because I think he was the driving force. You know, he was the most ambitious in a way. He had this amazing talent for melody. And he kind of kept them together. They also resented him towards the end, but that was because he was being a bit pushy. None of the others, you know, John was too zonked out to have even got to the studio on every day. So yeah, and I think Paul got a very tough time after John was killed. That everyone suddenly decided, oh well, John was the good one, Paul was the
he had the talent.
easy, smarmy one. And I think that was extremely unfair on him. And I also think that just to have remained sane for all this time under such amazing pressure and graceful, I think, is a great achievement. So Paul gets my vote.
The subtitle is 1, 2, 3, 4, The Beatles in Time, which I think is perfect. I mean, does it also refer to the 4 seasons of the elements, you know, fire, water, whatever, wind? And,
yeah,
you know,
so I hope that's an original idea. Yeah, I did have this idea that each of them represented an element of, I'll probably get them all wrong now, George is air, Ringo earth, John fire, and Paul water. And I think actually that's why it's wrong to separate any of them for sort of special mention in a way, because they were a band and they worked uniquely well as a band, and none of them were quite as interesting after they split up. And so they all needed each other and thrived off each other's company.
That's a wonderful place to end. They are indivisible, and they were greater than the sum of their parts. I've never understood that expression. Craig Brown, author of this book, The Beatles 1, 2, 3, 4. I mean, I'm going to get the title wrong again, but it's a complete cracking read. Take it on your sun lounges and your summer staycations in your social bubbles, everybody. Craig Brown, thank you so much for talking to us about your new book.
Thanks very much, Rachel. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.